Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few seconds. We're just waiting for everyone to enter into the webinar. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this evening on Politics and Prose Live. We're here with Sarah Smarsh to talk about her new book, She Come By It Natural. And you can purchase a copy of that book through a link in our chat, which I've posted. It'll take you to Politics and Prose's website. It's a great way to support our author and to also support your local independent bookstore. Secondly, the latter portion of tonight's event is going to be devoted to your questions, and we really encourage everyone to ask a question. And you can do so by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There's also a chat that you can use, but we prefer if you put your questions in the Q&A box. It just makes things a little bit easier. And with that out of the way, tonight I am excited to introduce Sarah Smarsh to Politics and Prose Live. She's a Kansas-based journalist who has reported for numerous publications, and her first book, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth, was a finalist for the National Book Award. Tonight she'll be discussing her new book, She Come By It Natural, Dolly Parton and the Women Who Lived Her Songs. The book examines the life and art of Dolly Parton and how they reflect rural, working class women and the underappreciated impact they've had on social progress. Tonight, Sarah will be in conversation with Trae, most recently known for his liberal redneck series of viral videos. His best-selling book is also called Liberal Redneck Manifesto, Dragging Dixie Out of the Dark. So with that said, guys, the screen is yours.
All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate that introduction. Hey, Sarah, how's it going?
Hey, Trae. It's going pretty good. The book comes out tomorrow, so I'm excited. I'm enjoying the whiskey. I'm not going to lie.
All right. I like it. I'm excited, too. I'm excited to be here. I'm honored and thrilled that you invited me. So it's a pleasure already. So, the book is as amazing as I knew it would be before I cracked it open. So congratulations on a job well done. Very, very good.
Thank you.
It made me think of a million different things that I would love to ask you about, love to talk to you about. But obviously at first, let's sort of be very explicit about the book and the subject matter and get into what it is and why people should read it. So as you said up top, it's book about Dolly Parton and how she kind of represents this lesser known or more oft ignored American woman's experience, the rural, poor American woman, and how the importance of that to all the women like her, and sort of drawing a contrast between that and the idea of like feminism as a political concept, or the more academic, philosophical version of it from the universities and whatnot. So I guess my question is, my first question, at what point did this kind of like crystallize in your mind as something that you could and should and would like to write about? Because I feel like this is probably one of those things that you've sort of known to be true and understood at some level for a very, very long time. But how did it, sort of more formalize itself in your mind as like something you really needed to cover?
Well, first, before I dive into that answer, let me say thanks for joining me. And to everybody listening, I want you to know that I was a Trae fan before it was cool. And I believe I have the bragging rights of being the first guest on his podcast, which you should all subscribe to if you don't already.
That's true.
So the origin story of this book, if you will, involves the election year that was 2016, quite pivotal moment in American politics, of course. And I have long covered and written about socioeconomic class as it intersects with a lot of different aspects of American identity, gender being one of them. And in 2016, hailing from the place I do, which, as you said, we might roughly call the rural working poor, specifically the white version of that. Mm-hmm. Every headline that was supposedly representing my people, if you will, was about the worst of them, and yep. And it bugged me in that, not that I've ever been one to sugarcoat the space I come from or any aspect of American reality, but that like bigot in the red hat spewing nastiness at the diner on Main Street, that ain't all of it.
Right.
And so simultaneous with that sort of consternation on my part as both a member of the media that I felt was kind of wasn't doing quite right by the whole story, and also, you know, my the foot that I still very much have in the place that I come from. I live in, I'm joining you from rural Kansas today. Simultaneous with that consternation was a big arena tour by Dolly Parton for the first time in a long time. And she had a new album out, and I hadn't really thought about Dolly Parton in a long time. And I was noticing just this sort of zeitgeist around her as a kind of universally beloved and unifying figure. And I thought, well, damned if she isn't the opposite of Donald Trump, if you will. I'm just going to go there. And in terms of like what she represents about the, you know, in a general sense, the place I come from, the people I know and love, she's the best of it, not the worst of it. And so I and also that year, misogyny was just rampant in that Hillary Clinton was, of course, the Democratic candidate.
Right.
And I was thinking a lot about class. And so here we had Dolly Parton kind of like bringing down these arenas. I went to a couple of those shows, and what I realized, Trae, is that country music written by women like her was, we might say, like the formative feminist text of my life. Right. And that preceded, you know, anything I learned about some kind of academic formal version of feminism, like you were saying at the top of our talk. So then this great magazine called No Depression had a fellowship application for a writer to investigate the intersection of roots music or Americana country music and broader social issues and culture. So I applied and told him I wanted to write about Dolly Parton as a sort of exemplar of what I would call working class feminism, which usually isn't articulated in any formal way, but it is more often embodied. It's an experiential feminism. And I got the fellowship and got to work. And I thought that, you know, like a few hundred people were going to read it. And that was okay by me. I love this. It's a very fine print only magazine. It's quite, you know, niche in its audience. And it was really a labor of love. And then happily, a few years later, here we find ourselves in another election year, and that writing has been lightly updated in book form for today.
Awesome. Well, I want to talk a little bit about that sort of disconnect between, you know, the Dolly Parton feminism and the academic feminism. Like, I hope it doesn't make you uncomfortable or anything. I'm going to read a couple. I've got some quotes, Sarah. I went through with a highlighter and I got some quotes from the book in here. So a couple of them on this subject. Parton's career took off at the same moment the women's liberation movement did, providing a revealing contrast between feminism as political concept and feminism embodied in the world. Like most women in poverty, Parton knew little of the former, but excelled at the latter. And then later in the book, you say, in this way, Parton was the skillful, uneducated ambassador of a movement attributed to college campuses and activist circles. Most women I grew up among in rural Kansas do not know who Gloria Steinem is, but they know the lines in Parton's late 20th century movies by heart and recognize themselves in her image. So where do you think the sort of like what is in the center of that disconnect between the two different kinds of the experience? Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, what's at the center of it is, in a word, class,
right. Yeah.
Which is not just, you know, I think we tend to think about class in with some sort of like vague sense of a dollar sign next to it, but it's not just money. It's the fabric of your life. It's the people you have occasion to meet. It's the language that you use. You know, like I often tell people in my talks that I speak two versions of English, country and fancy, and that's sort of like straddling a class line as I do in terms of where I come from and what I do now professionally. So, so the point of that is, you know, just the the stuff of life. It's a different world, and a evidence of that, I think some early reviewer maybe, or somewhere I saw a comment sort of taking me to task for that line about Gloria Steinem, and it was something along the lines of, I find it hard, she's probably exaggerating that someone
Right.
in somewhere doesn't know who Gloria Steinem is. No, yeah. I ain't exaggerating.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not even shameful, it's not like something to clutch your pearls over. It's a different world where I come from, and reading books and the concept of theory, I think I say in the book somewhere, maybe in the foreword, that where I come from, theory is a good guess about how the fox keeps getting in the chicken house. So, so that's real. So that's the dividing line, and that's why, and one side of the line isn't better than the other. I'm not arguing that the working class woman that doesn't have access to those forms of cultural capital is somehow more noble for it. And I'm not arguing that the woman who has had a great deal of, education formally, is, has lost some sort of cred or is hollow in her feminism. On either side of the line, there are hollow forms of it and feminism embodied, but it is a fact of the matter that the women who raised me, the women who raised Dolly Parton, don't get any credit for my gender's progress, and they certainly deserve it.
Right. Because I feel like that's the thing with a lot of the poor rural experiences, not getting any credit or being ignored or whatever, tends to be a theme. And I feel like another theme is the feeling of being condescended to and that sort of thing. And I was wondering how much of that element you think exists with, rural working women, or women like the ever-present Grandma Betty, from the books, who reminds me of my own Mama. And that feeling of like being looked down upon by, the women who talk about what it's like to be a woman in America on TV. You know what I mean? Like, and if that adds to the rift or whatever.
Meaning, does it add to like my own vantage? Kind of like, did I see that firsthand, or?
I guess just the way that, it's obvious why they identify more with Dolly Parton than Gloria Steinem, like, because Dolly is, singing about and representing their experience. But I guess I'm asking, do you think that they feel like, not to just single out Gloria Steinem, but to use her as just the prototypical like academic feminist, that they feel not only unrepresented by, but like excluded by, or like I said, condescended to or looked down upon, the way that I think a lot of rural Americans feel about the equivalent in whatever type of, field you're talking about?
Yeah. Okay. So, my take on this is basically that there is some real condescension. There is some overt classism. There is absolutely no doubt about it. I've seen it firsthand. Every woman who is from where I'm from has seen it. Your Mima's seen it. Dolly Parton's seen it. However, I think that just as often, or maybe even more often, there is just sort of a, I think you've used the word disconnect a few times. Sometimes, first of all, there is a classism that's not overt or conscious. It's a sort of a subconscious idea held by the woman of a middle or upper class, and she actually means well, you know what I mean? And yet can be somehow cutting all the same, just for sort of channeling the biases of our society unchecked. And then you also got to add to that the layer of a woman who is hearing, how do I put this? As a writer, I go back to language frequently. And I think that, ultimately that is the tool of our political discourse. And even if you turn on the nightly news, what you're encountering is a language that can be quite exclusive. And it's not for condescension on the part of the broadcaster using it, or the Gloria Steinem coming in as a guest. It's that they have had occasion to acquire a different tool set. And so the working poor woman at home, and this isn't just about education either, this is about culture, it's about race. You know, we have different dialects, we have different experiences of language. And so what I'm saying is, somebody like my grandma could feel that someone's use of big fancy words, if you will, is off-putting. Right. But where that's coming from is internal to her, in her own self-consciousness and insecurity, in a society that has told her over and over that she's trash. And she doesn't know what this word is that's being used, and it's not for lack of intellect, it's for lack of formal education. And so at that point, you know, the bridges and the possibilities for connection start to crumble.
Right. With the idea of Dolly being this kind of ambassador and everything, it made me think about, and this gets brought up in the book too. One thing that I've always very much appreciated about Dolly is how completely, I guess, sort of unapologetic and she is about the way she talks, the way she is, the way she feels about things, where she's from, completely uninterested in like altering any of that to better fit into, you know, an idealized version of what you're supposed to be like in this country. You know, you've got a quote in the book from another person you had talked to that says that, and this is true in my experience, that a whole lot of poor rural people who leave or do something else go out of their way to distance themselves from their background or their upbringing. You know what I mean? Like if you're from the South and you have the accent, like you work hard to lose the accent. Obviously I didn't, but that's what I'm saying. It's because of how
you
much
failed.
Right. Well, I never tried. I never had any interest in it because I'm not disparaging the people who do that, because I understand why you do that. If you're going to go work on Wall Street and you're from Alabama or something, you probably need to lose the accent because it will be a detriment to you. But I always like looked up to Dolly and people like her who kind of went the opposite way and just like sort of wore it on her sleeves, you know, and just put it in front of everybody for them to deal with. And I guess I'm just wondering like how important you think that is in the mystique of her whole thing and what she represents. Like that has to like strengthen that bond that people feel with her, right? Because of the level of representation that they feel like they see there.
Yeah, no, it's everything. What you just articulated is everything onto Dolly Parton and her appeal. So, and I think one of the reasons that I was well equipped to maybe analyze or attempt to articulate, we might think of as her sort of like paradoxical eternal return to home through her stories and her quote unquote trashy look and her, you know, refusing to stop saying ain't or whatever. You know, as I write, she could have like classed herself up a long time ago, and she's a smart woman. It's not like she wouldn't know how to do that. It's not like she wouldn't know how to change all of those markers. She chose not to, as you said. And so that therein lies this incredible paradox about her, which is she's at the height of fame and fortune, and yet she's still presenting as, you know, like the town trollop on whom she, that's her language, on whom she based her physical persona. And so
why do you think she does that?
Well, I think that, you know, I was just pausing to kind of reflect on how incredible, like she still amazes me. And I thought about her for a long time and spent a year writing about her. But like most folks, if they did that, it would become inauthentic. It would become an affectation. Because at some point, okay, you were down home for 18 years, but you've been rich for 60. So how long do you get to play that song on the fiddle? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like it's still real in her, and I think that and maybe you, as somebody who comes from Tennessee, could talk about the extent to which she is her realness and authenticity and true affection for home and commitment to it comes through in her presence in community and philanthropy around those parts and around the world. But quickly, I was alluding to the reason why I might be well equipped to catch some of this. And so when I left home, if I had a few whiskeys, my accent would come out. There are probably some people somewhere who are like, I can already hear it, because whatever, they're in a different realm of the country. But when I went to journalism school, one of the first things they told, and I thought I was going to go into broadcasting at the time, so it's all more important. I was flat out told, like, you need to get that twang out of there, Smarsh. And I actually didn't even consciously. I was on like this mission to make it, if you will, and so it didn't offend me none. I was just like, and so it is. And my voice just started shifting with my desire to belong, I suppose. And then at some point very early in my career, I started writing about class and rural places in a way that because I was the only one in the newsroom who could see those stories, because I had that lens that they didn't. So they had a blinder of class privilege, the way that white folks have a blinder of racial privilege, and so on.
Right.
And that has been I think that's what I'm here to do. That's how I'm of service to my field. And similarly, Dolly, while you could, Nashville country music, supposedly there's a bunch of country folks, they ain't all real country, as you know. And she's realer than the realest person in the room. And I think she just thought, like, I'm gonna bear witness to this. Now we might argue that it's character, and yet it's also real within her, which is amazing.
Yeah, I agree completely. I want to circle back to something you actually said at the very beginning. You were talking about the contrast that formed in your mind and a lot of people's minds in 2016, right? With just the cultural landscape in this country, and how there was a huge narrative at the time about Donald Trump and how he won over rural white working class people, specifically, like you said, your people, my people. I mean, that's where my people are too. And I felt the exact same thing you did, about like, why is it always the same thing? Like anytime we ever get talked about, it's always the same thing. Like you said, it's the racist guy in the red hat or whatever. And it drives me crazy too. And I'm gonna be honest about something here and not to be pessimistic, but like, I think Dolly might even be an example of it. You said you saw Dolly and you had this, like, not epiphany, but you thought to yourself, well, see, she represents like the very best of us. That's great. She needs to be appreciated for that. I agree completely, but I feel like, and I've experienced this to some extent myself in talking to people. I think a lot of the people who have that endearing image of what rural American is, and it's negative, like we were talking about, the negative stereotype, I think a lot of those people kind of, without even meaning to, discount or exclude people like Dolly Parton as, she, and I don't want to say one of the good ones, but you know what I mean? Like, she's from there and everything, but she's not the same thing they are. That's why she's awesome. It's like, why don't Dolly count? Why don't you and I count when people assess where we're from? It's like, why do you only count in your assessment of that area and those people the bad, even when you have positive examples to draw from? But people take the positive examples and like set them to a side in a different area in their brain, in my experience. And I was wondering how you feel about that.
Yeah. So please forgive me that this is not by any means a perfect analogy, because class and race are like apples and oranges, but to some extent, this is what you're describing as like the class parallel of what Black Americans would refer to as the magical Negro phenomenon within like the white psyche, that explains, if like he's okay, and we're going to explain it because he's exceptional among the Black race. We like him, but it must be because he's so different from this broader group of people that we hate. So and I had that experience in, let's say, like, I went to graduate school at an Ivy League institution, which was like where my class consciousness really was lit up. And, I would have people say to my face, like, well, they would, if they knew where I was from somehow before we spoke, I was like the resident trailer trash, if you will.
Mhm.
And it was like the psychological schema couldn't, for some people, resolve that I was from where I was from, and that when I was speaking eloquently or writing better than they were in some cases, you know what I mean? And so it became, while I made good friends there, I mean, there were some asses that didn't want me around, but for the most part, I was like, quote unquote, accepted. But among the folks who accepted me, some of them could only explain me as like, I'm this other thing. And they'd ask me questions like, they'd ask me questions about back home, like it was this wasteland that I'd left behind full of heathens. And it's like, well, I just got off the horn with my dad an hour ago. Like, my people they're smart, they're brilliant. They didn't go to college, but I learned more about storytelling from them in some ways than I'm learning in this classroom. So I don't know, you tell me.
Yeah. And I think that, to me, without ever even really thinking about it in the beginning, I've thought about it since, I think that the last two things we talked about are related in my mind, of like with Dolly and holding on to the accent and the other aspects of who she was and how she grew up, and refusing to sort of just like cast those aside. With me and not losing the accent and talking about it all in the same way, part of it is, for me, has to do with this other thing we're talking about, where it's almost like trying to force people to reconcile the two. You know what I mean? It's like, no, I'm both. Like, she is both. You can be both. Like, you know what I mean? I don't have to turn from that into this, which is what, is acceptable to you. Like, it don't have to work like that, and I feel like Dolly's just like one of the highest profile people and most successful people who has sort of done that exact thing. I want to ask you about, because you brought it up just a minute ago, a more lighthearted question. And also I want to say, I fully expect that I'm about to get schooled on something right now, but there is one area in particular that I know where Dolly and I are on the same page, and you have chosen a different path. And that has to do with the term white trash, right? You talk about in the book, you talk about Dolly like being loud and proud white trash and using that exact term to refer to herself and everything. And I do that too. I call myself trash all the time. And I, just and sometimes being funny, but also just sincerity, like, look, what do you want me to tell you? I'm trash. I can't help it, and you point out in there, you say about yourself, I don't use that term. She has every right to, but I choose not to. And I was just wondering if you could go into some more detail on that.
Yeah, I love this question, and it's the first time I've ever been asked this. I think that you and Dolly we're on first name basis, obviously. You and Dolly are you have the same tact, because in a lot of ways she's also a comedian. She's the way she presents is like in her shows, it's quips and puns. I'm not like, it's and also a dark humor. There are like multiple layers to her humor that is maybe a defense mechanism, maybe it's just who she is, I don't know. But so that it makes sense that you all would have the same approach. Now, when I'm like, drinking a beer with my partner in our quarantine situation, and I will, if I'm like bitching to him about something that has to do with class, like I will say, but I'm trash, so did it, like I use that language in very intimate settings. My stance about it as a writer and journalist is never passing judgment on others' reclamation of the term, if you will. It's just that there are so many people who are using it who don't have permission, and they're not using it. They're not using it ironically or it is in a sense hate speech coming out of a lot of people's mouths. I'm just trying to counter that by making a sort of statement about we ought not be referring to any human being as trash. But that said, like when you do that in your act, it feels like a release to me. It's very validating, and because of the way that you handle it. So it's it's more often about the energy behind the word than it is the word itself.
Right on. Okay, I've got some heavier stuff I definitely want to ask you about. But first, before we do that, I want to talk about country music just a little bit, because obviously, that's what Dolly does. I'm the type that, like, people ask me, people outside the South, usually if they ask me, do you like country music? I always say some version of, well, yes, I love country music, but I bet what you are thinking of as country music in your head, I cannot stand. So, I need to clarify that. The stuff that I call, that I like is now called Americana or whatever. But, right. And then the classic country I hate the direction pop country is gone. And it's one of those things where, like, people, rock and roll fans say the same thing about it. But it didn't used to be that way, meaning, like, Dolly Parton is head to toe legit, completely authentic, writes all her own songs. They come from a very authentic, lived place. And she also was massive. You know what I mean? Like, in terms of her success and her stardom. And at some point, the two sort of, like, separated, in my opinion, as a country music fan. And I'm wondering just how you feel about the current state of country music. And I want to ask about female country artists too in just a second. But how you feel about where country music is at right now?
Yeah, well, I'm with you that, if we're using the sort of, at this point, almost archaic framework of radio play, country radio, as the, stick that we're going to measure by, then it's quite grim, Trae. It's a bleak, highly manufactured, glossy, inauthentic, falsely Christian, hollow conservative mess. Meanwhile, though, there is great country music being made by contemporary artists, including young artists. A lot of them, will sell out a show, or they did in, like, the before times, and they will after the pandemic. But, like, they're all genres now have this sort of fracture between what's on the radio and what, like, people are finding on through streaming or whatever. But with country music, it's particularly profound in that what's on the radio now is almost unrecognizable in sound from when you and I were kids. And even when we were kids, there was already a popwards drift, if you will. And Dolly embraced that. She wanted to be a crossover artist, but concurrent with that was her, just, like, abiding love for the sound of where she came from. And that had to do with Appalachia and banjo and a fusion of poor whites and African influences. And that's, you'd be hard pressed to find that on what is now presented. I caught a little bit of, I don't know if it was the CMAs, the Country Music Awards, that was on fairly recently, or if it was another award show for the genre. But it was like, what was receiving accolades was just, it didn't belong even in the largest tent version of country music to my ears.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm getting old or what.
No, I know. I was going to I wanted to make a joke in one of my videos about like radio country, and I looked up, I had no idea what it was, and I looked up what just happened to be the #1 country music hit on Billboard at that point in time. And this is like 6 or 7 months ago now. But I looked it up, and it was a song by Marshmello, the DJ with the marshmallow head, it's like a sentient confectionery, that guy. He was #1 on the country radio charts. And yeah, like you said, it just bears no resemblance to what I remember. But the second part of the question, though, specifically, that is also part of the bull crap regarding current country music. I remember my dad was pure rock and roll. My mom was the one who listened to country when I was a kid.
You're like you're like if Donnie and Marie
Osmond yeah, a little bit country
had an incestuous baby.
Yeah, that's me. I got all the country music from my mom, and so I remember, or at least like when I think back on it, at that point in time, like early 90s and mid 90s and whatnot, the country music that my mama was listening to, there were a whole lot of very, very prominent women involved that were popular then. Reba and Martina McBride and Pam Tillis and Trisha Yearwood and Dana Carter, one of my personal favorites. And the list goes on and on. They were very prevalent and very popular then. And now on radio country, and you point out in the book, you said in 2016, less than 10% of radio airplay on country radio went to women artists, and only 5 women reached the Billboard charts for country music in that entire year. Like, what is that about? Like, what's up with that, Sarah?
Well, here's my best guess. And by the way, when I very lightly revised the writing for the book, it turns out that stat you just cited was still true in 2019, even though a lot of female artists, including Martina McBride, quite vocally, shout out to Kansas's own Martina, raised a lot of hell about that. It didn't shift anything in terms of the Nashville power levers. And my theory, Trae, is that, God, I always go back to politics, and I'm starting to hate this about myself. But I think that the right has been so adept at harnessing the culture of that space, of rural America, things that previously were pretty much apolitical. The flag, God, country music, pickup trucks. I'm thinking to myself as a progressive, like, you don't own that.
I know.
Conservatives,
Preach.
You don't get to have that.
I know.
But they've claimed it, and so I just think that somehow that industry, which has had moments of like progressive breakthroughs, and Dolly Parton's voice is one of them from day one, singing very feminist lyrics, even if she wasn't overtly a feminist with a capital F. Somehow the broader culture, it has swung right, absolutely, in the course of our lifetimes. And so I think that whether it's intentional or not, it's not necessarily some vast conspiracy, but there is a deep sexism going on in that industry that's just sort of selecting the male voices. And when I was researching this, the folks at the top of the sort of like Nashville radio power structure are like, well, the reason is there aren't as many good songs by women. It's like when people in my industry say, well, we would, in journalism, they say, well, we would publish more Black voices, but there aren't as many Black writers. It's like, what? They're just blind to it, even if it's not malicious in intent. You know what I mean?
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to get to the audience's questions here in just a second. I have one more thing I definitely want to say to you. It's related to what we're talking earlier, the political landscape of it all and everything. There's a quote in the book that I just absolutely adore because it's so related to the exact way that I have felt about our current political landscape in this country. And you're talking specifically about feminism, but I think it even applies more broadly. So the quote is, "The moment a woman is statistically most likely to be murdered by her male abuser," Steinem pointed out, "is when she escapes. Losing control of her is the unbearable threat that makes the violent ex-husband snap. Expanding this idea to a patriarchy losing control of half of the U.S. population would indeed explain a lot about recent years." I love that because I agree with it fully, because I've tried to maintain, but sometimes I feel like people think I'm just telling myself this or this is overly optimistic, but I've tried to maintain that really what we're seeing with the rise of alt-right and Trump's America and the Nazis are back and all this stuff is really their death throes. Like they know that they have been losing, and they finally like realize like, oh, we're losing. And then and they panicked, they freaked out, and this is the result of it. It's their last gasp effort to maintain control of this country and this culture. That's what I think. And I just wanted to let you know how much I love that, but also, expand on it if you want to, or if you feel like.
No, man, I think you said it perfectly, and I agree. And it's why, folks on our side, who I believe will be on the right side of history, should take heart. They're dangerous times. The parallel being, unfortunately, the woman escaping domestic abuse who encounters the highest risk moment for her life being taken. They're dangerous times, but it shouldn't then be assigned to us of like, oh, the pendulum is swinging so far. Well, forget a pendulum, because we never want to swing back. There's this sense that like, oh, well, this means that any semblance of democracy that we had is collapsing. What's really going on is that we're moving toward a more real and righteously true democracy. And the fact that they're all kicking and screaming should be validation to keep going.
Right. Amen. Yes, I love it. Okay. All right. So to the audience now, I'm going to say, I'm going to do my best here. They told me where to click and where to look, so I'm going to look at it. I pulled up the Q&A. All right. Yeah, I've got some questions here, so let's dive into them. Sarah Meredith Cabe says, my sense as a fan is that Dolly was accepting and celebrating her LGBTQ fans at a time when few others in the country music world did. Is this the case? I have always admired this about her.
Oh, it's absolutely the case. And it's evidenced in her massive LGBTQ following. But, as far as like specific decisions she made along the way, even just her language, we're talking about like years before there was a mainstream discussion about transgender folks. She would make comments like, she's so self-aware about gender because her career is what I say in the book is like the greatest gender performance of all time. She's very sophisticated about understanding the difference between, like who are you biologically, who are you in spirit, who are you in presentation, who are you in choice, and the extent to which there are so many layers of social construct. Like she understood that a long time ago. I think it was in like 2006, she wrote a song for a film called Trans America about the transgender experience. And I believe she performed it at the Oscars. It was nominated for an Academy Award. She received death threats for her embrace of that community, and maybe also because of the song that she wrote went so far as to compare gender transition to the crucifixion of Christ. This is as a Christian woman. Mm-hmm. So she ruffled some feathers on that one. It's real. She's just an incredibly accepting and non-judgmental person. So we might say a real Christian.
Yeah, I know. Seems like those are few and far between sometimes. But anyway, I agree with you. You set me up for something earlier, and I just blazed on by it. And I want to make sure that this gets said because I want this to be said at some point. Yet Dolly Parton is extremely philanthropic and very active in the community and giving back to it. Both my sons were Imagination Library readers as kids. She gives out a free book every month to children up until the age of 5. But she's done a million more things than that. When the brutal wildfires happened in East Tennessee a few years ago, Dolly immediately just sort of took action and gave money back to everyone affected by it. You talk about in the book, you point out how like she doesn't make people go through this like laborious process to prove that they deserve it. That, you know what I mean? It's like, where are you from? Are you from Sevierville? Then, here's some money to help you right now because everybody in Sevierville is suffering because of these fires. She's always been saintly in that regard. And she is, and look, at this point, she is viewed this way by all of the country, but like in Tennessee, she's she's like a deity pretty much. She's a goddess. She's like worshipped, and rightfully so. Like, you can't really say anything bad about Dolly Parton anywhere in the state of Tennessee, if you know what's good for you, Sarah. Yeah. But again, I think that it's just straight up an American thing at this point. So back to the questions. Barbara Gronquist asked, this was earlier in the conversation, we were talking about that disconnect, right? She says, do you think that the aims of working class feminism and academic feminism are the same? And if so, how do we all work together to advance the cause? And if they are different, how do we reconcile the two?
I don't think they're the same, in that working class feminism, as I understand it or describe it, has no specific goals other than surviving.
Right. Yeah.
That's it. And, my argument is, as a woman in that space, when just getting by is so precarious, you have no choice but to believe in your own worth. That's sort of, I don't know if bravado is quite the right word, but that sass that people recognize in Dolly Parton, that's every woman that I came up around. And it's because you must believe that you are deserving of something, equal to, or maybe even more than the dudes around you, in the context of poverty and economic struggle. The feminist movement that is, swirls around college campuses and activists, young and old, it is, it has like an organizational structure to some extent, and kind of a playbook, and that playbook is always evolving, and there are debates, and you're talking about it. Working class feminism is not only is it undiscussed by the woman who is embodying it, it's not even conscious necessarily.
Yeah.
But it's no less real for that reason.
Okay, so a related question here, and I will say before I even ask the question that this is very, very definitely answered in the book, so certainly read the book, but I'm going to throw it up to you, and so you can respond to it if you like, or just say, hey, read the book. But it's from Sarah Lamata. She says, I know that Dolly has at times refused to identify as a feminist. At the very least, she has rejected the label. What are your thoughts about that?
Thank you for that question, Sarah, because it gets to the heart of the book, which is examining, and Trae and I've talked a little bit about it now, the difference between talking about something and living it. Now, you can do both simultaneously, but you can also do one without the other. And it occurred to me, in thinking about Dolly and the women who raised me, that if I had a choice between a woman who wears the word feminist on a t-shirt, but yet in her let's say her domestic life, she's making choices that are counter to the concept of women's equality. If I had to choose between that and a woman who's like, I don't like the term feminism, and that's because a particular political faction has successfully weaponized it and has convinced her that it's a bad thing, okay? Mm-hmm. And yet at home, in life, at work, she is like exquisitely living the tenets of feminism. If I got to pick between one or the other, I take option B.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we got a few. These are all from the same person, so I'm going to read them all together. From Rebecca Kraft, a statement at first that I will read, and then there's a couple of questions at the end. So this is all from Rebecca Kraft. She says, she is a genius, and that is significant in a sort of great person theory of history, first in terms of her talent, and then in terms of her standing up for herself and knowing that she had that genius, starting with dumping Porter Wagner, and in her knowing that she had the genius to succeed as herself. My questions are, what's your favorite Dolly song? And is your title an interesting double entendre?
Wow, I had not previously thought about the word "come" in the title. Thank you for that. So I'm just going to say yes. Yes, it is. It is an absolutely dirty title, and we should all think of it that way from now on.
It never, nothing like that ever occurred to me either, for the record. Rebecca's head's in the gutter over here, but
yeah. But the question about my favorite Dolly song, it's an impossible question, of course. It's like defining God, but I'm gonna say The Bargain Store, which is Dolly telling the story of, in the first person, a woman who is likening herself to something you'd find in a secondhand thrift shop, which is just an incredibly genius use of metaphor as a working class woman who is familiar with only ever possessing something that's previously used, for her economic disadvantage. And then she herself, Dolly was writing this at a moment when slut shaming didn't even have a word yet, and the concept of a pure virgin bride dominated, even though that surely wasn't the reality for a lot of women, Dolly included, as she has discussed. She says, my life, my heart, my body, they're like something you find in a bargain store. It's used, it's not new, it's not virgin, but it's still good. And there might be a little bit of dirtiness to that song, actually, because she says, she suggests, I think, maybe that she might even be better than something brand new. And so The Bargain Store, check it out.
Right on. Like you said, it's impossible to name one. I've always been a huge fan of story songs, as I call my songs, that have like a narrative, especially when they're like brutally sad. So I guess I'll say Down from Dover, which you talk about in the book. That's definitely up there. Also, I could be so far off on this, Sarah, but if I may, just as a comedian, and again, this never once occurred to me, but since you brought up it being an entendre, I wonder if she means the word natural and not the word come. I wonder if it's a boob joke that Rebecca was making.
Oh, God. So, like, I took it to the next level.
I mean, I don't know. That's my theory, as we,
Well, I don't think the word natural would never even, it isn't even part of the Dolly discussion, because she's quite, she's forthcoming about her own nips and tucks and enhancements.
Right.
And so I think that there's that famous Seinfeld line, they're real and they're spectacular. I think that Dolly would say, like, they're fake and they're spectacular.
Yeah. Okay, so let me see here. All right. Mary Helfrich says, Rick Bragg talks about the graduate school demeaning in his book, All Over But the Shouting. Do you think it's an East Coast, West Coast kind of judgment, or do Southern women, quote, of means, like the junior league types, also act condescending to poor Southern women?
Well, first of all, I'm a huge fan of Rick Bragg, so I'm happy that his work was brought into the fold. Sure. Classism. It's okay. Let me give you an example. I just wrote a story about rural post offices for National Geographic. Of course, there's this financial crisis around the post office and a political attack on that service. Where I grew up, it was almost entirely white. There was a bit of racial diversity, no Black folks specifically. This little town of 3,000 people is where I went to school, 10 miles down the road from our farm. And I was absolutely convinced that my friend whose dad was the postmaster was rich. Okay. So my point about this is that there are, like, you get in within at every class rung, there are rungs within that rung, and absolutely human nature and the human ego and its desire to feel superior finds its ways. And nobody in where I went to school, nobody had nothing to brag about, right. in like social terms, and yet I was sort of toward the bottom of the ladder, and I understood that through a lot of different social cues. So absolutely, what he articulates, there are microcosms of it, even among working class communities.
For sure. It's so funny you say that. In one of my earliest videos, I was talking about my hometown and the phenomenon with them supporting Trump then or whatever. And in explaining my hometown in the video, I said something like, it's like, you got to understand, this is a town where you're considered a rich kid if your daddy carries the mail.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, because that's literally true. I know exactly what you mean. All right. Okay. So moving on. Yeah, we got about 5 minutes left. Let's see what we got here. Aaron Duncan. And there are some questions in here. But Sarah, your book Heartland was such a gift. I grew up in Franklin County, Nebraska, 30 miles north of Smith Center, Kansas. That's actually where the nearest Pizza Hut was. My grandmothers both worked their entire lives out of need: secretary, cooking, bookkeeper, babysitting, driving a truck. So have my mother and aunts and all my friends from high school who still farm and ranch with their husbands. Why do you think the concept of feminism has fallen so flat in rural places where women really are equal in work? Is it just the messenger? I learned to be a feminist from these women. P.S. I wish we could compare notes sometimes. Thank you for your work.
Thank you so much for your good words about Heartland and the bit of story from your own home. I think, and I mentioned this earlier, that the term has been weaponized, and that began, day one. It depends on like how far you want to go back. Let's talk about the suffrage movement at the turn of the 20th century. There were cartoons portraying these women as these sort of hag-like, foul, nasty creatures, and then fast forward to the 1970s, and there were kind of parallel tropes about the man-hating, mean, nasty, angry feminist. In fact, Dolly Parton often, when she responds to the term, she'll say, "Well, I love men," as though she needs to qualify that you can
Right.
simultaneously, and that's successful messaging from that faction. So yeah, I think that it is, but okay, I'm going to add to that because I can't just keep blaming the folks with that particular agenda for their success. I got to also blame my own side for not caring enough to mount a defense. You know what I mean? And by that, I mean, like, to speak specifically to your wonderful female family members in Nebraska who are, they could teach people a thing or two about feminism, I bet. And yet if they themselves are averse to the term, it means that that these sort of academic circles that to some extent I take to task in some of my work need to do a better job of, as you say, being good messengers for the cause.
Stacia Marlett says, I'm from rural Wisconsin, which no one can ever believe because I'm a very direct person. Obviously, I don't meet their idea of someone from, quote, the country. Anyway, I'm wondering how Southern rural people relate to or don't relate to rural folks from other parts of the country.
Well, you should answer this, Trae. The way that I finally found to articulate where I'm from, which I grew up about 30 miles north of the Oklahoma line. Yeah. So I would describe that as like the lower Midwest. But you, Trae, what do you think?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of moments in our conversation already that answer that question. Just the male thing a minute ago, or a lot of things you were saying earlier, and I was like, "Yeah, preach, tell me about it." Because I agree with you. Kansas. I also would call Kansas the Midwest. I wouldn't call it the South. And I'm from the deep South. And obviously, you and I, we've known this about each other for a long time. We have a lot of things in common, and we relate on a lot of things. And I think that the shared rural experience is a big part of that. I also am a touring, when it's legal to do it, I'm a touring stand-up comedian, and I go all over the place to all other states. And usually, and I'm super into this, I love this, a lot of my fans, whatever state they're in, they tend to be like from the sticks of that particular state, and they'll drive into the city to come see the show or whatever. So I've met a whole lot of rural people from all around the country, and I relate dearly to all of them. Like there is certainly, they're not all the same, of course, but there's definitely something about the shared experience that I think bonds people together to me.
Agreed.
An anonymous attendee says, but I've already read it, it's fine, there's nothing to worry about even though it's anonymous, says, thank you, Sarah and Trae. I wanted to ask what you thought about Dolly recently saying she fully supports the Black Lives Matter movement. I saw some figures on the right talking about canceling her despite the fact that she's immune to that. This seems like one of the times she's been super explicit about her positions, even though it's clear that Dolly has supported Black artists throughout her career. What do you think about that?
Well, it is one of the few times she's been explicit, and that was specifically in a cover story for Billboard magazine that came out in August. And Oh, the way that I see it is, it occurred to her. She was asked straight up in this by this interviewer, like, do Black Lives Matter? And her answer was, of course Black Lives Matter. Do you think our lily white asses are the only ones that matter? And she went off on this tirade, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who knows her,
Right.
that that's her view. But what was slightly surprising was the direct and overt statement of something that's seemingly political. And I think what's going down with that one is Dolly she stays off politics, but from her lens as a decent person, that ain't even about politics. It's about
Right.
morality.
Right.
It's about human decency. It's about right and wrong. It's not like a moral equivalence between left and right. It's like about whether someone deserves the dignity of walking down the street without being murdered by a policeman. So I was heartened to hear her make that statement, even though it didn't surprise me.
Okay, we've got 3 questions left. The one that's next up, I'm actually going to say for the end. I think it feels like a good closing question because we are reaching the close here. Let's get into the other ones first. This one's from Catherine Belden. Which of Dolly's songs do you think best conveys her feminism? And I mean, I feel like you kind of touched on that. That question is from earlier, but anyway, go ahead. If you have a different answer or one you'd like to point out.
Well, I don't know if I'm supposed to reveal this, but for those tuning in, Catherine Belden is my brilliant, genius, wonderful editor at Scribner Books. And and I love you, Kathy. Thank you for being here tonight. Gosh, the song that most was the question, which one kind of exemplifies her take on class and gender?
It was feminism specifically is what the
Feminism
question said.
specifically. Okay.
Her brand of feminism.
Yeah. I would say, now this song is a little bit schmaltzy, and I'm not saying, I don't even love this song necessarily. But I'm going to say she wrote a song called She's an Eagle When She Flies. And I want to say like 1991. It was like right before country music kicked her to the curb for getting too old and being too twangy. She went off and did kind of like a bluegrass thing for a while. But right before that, she had a pop hit called She's an Eagle When She Flies. And it's, she makes no quote unquote political statement, but the whole song is about the resilience of women. What she never discusses is, what does the woman need to be resilient against or about? And so therein is the implicitly conveyed statement that this is a man's world. And for a woman to have the freedom to fly, it will require resilience and the spirit of a warrior. Again, it's the melody itself is a little bit cheesy, but I think it says a lot.
Okay, we got one from Ella Fund Resnicek. Hope I got that right, Ella. Says, thank you very much, Sarah and Trae, from a fellow former Kansas girl, currently celebrating Thanksgiving in British Columbia, Canada. 2 things. Number 1, really appreciate your conversation on dialect earlier in the discussion, especially since right before you started, I warned my Canadian partner that my now Canadian accent is going to shift back for at least the next couple hours after watching this, which I appreciate. Number 2, are you aware of any musicians who are set to pick up Dolly's mantle someday of class and gender conscious music?
I would love to hear your take on this, Trae, but quickly, I would say, if we expand this across genres, because I think that, young women of all stripes benefit from women like Dolly and her generation. In the foreword, I mention Lizzo as a hip hop star who, to me, she's like taking what Dolly gave us. I make an argument that Dolly's like the original third wave feminist, by which I mean she's like, not only am I equal and not only do I reject gender constructs, but I'm also going to blow your mind by simultaneously having huge boobs and wearing high heels and like totally playing that part. And yet I'm in control on doing it. And so, like, who's the punk now? Lizzo is, and a lot of young female artists do that today, but it was absolutely revolutionary in Dolly's time. So I'd throw that name out there. What do you think, Trae?
Yeah, I got a couple, I think, in the world of country music. And when I say country, I mean like, the good stuff. So probably Americana is where you'd have to find the people I'm about to name. I think the biggest, most successful one that I think is definitely a Dolly devotee, and you actually mentioned her in the book, would be Casey Musgraves. But Casey's like, kind of crossed over, gone mainstream now, but I still think she's great. Lesser known, Margot Price is up there too. Margot Price is wonderful. Amanda Shires. A couple that I think people may not know as much that I think are awesome, that are country as hell and tell these kinds of stories. There's Sarah Shook, who's from.
I was about to say Sarah Shook.
Yeah, Sarah Shook. She's from North Carolina. She's a bisexual, badass country singer. So she sings like songs about loss and love and tearing my beard type of stuff, but from a lesbian perspective or a bisexual perspective, but without like pointing a finger at it, just sort of like matter of factly, like it sounds like any other kind of heartbroken honky tonk song that you've ever heard. It's just the subject matter is a little different, and that's just how she rolls. Sarah's awesome. And there's another one, her name is Kelsey Walden, who just breaks me. Oh, and Elizabeth Cook, phenomenal.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Cook's been around for a while. She's wonderful. But Kelsey Walden is one who I really, really like a lot. She definitely sings from that like poor woman's perspective. She got this one song called "The Gold Mine," and it's basically just like I don't even want the gold mine. Like, I don't want to expect everything. I just want to be okay, and it just rips me into pieces. So Kelsey Walden, she's great.
I just saw a chat comment from, I think it was Jackie, maybe I just lost it, but she said Amanda Shires ? She is partnered with Jason Isbell, whom you folks might know from also alt country fame, or whatever they're calling real country these days. So
right,
but she's an incredible artist in her own right.
Yes, she is. That's 100% true. But yeah, okay, all right, Sarah, we're gonna bring it home here now. We'll make sure to plug the book and whatever at the end of this, but this is the last question. We're about to close with this, everybody. Well, actually, Rebecca Kraft just threw on here. Kelsey Walden is from Monkey's Elbow, Kentucky. I didn't know that, but I 100% believe it. That sounds right. Okay, so last one is for you, Sarah. Allison Witten says, Sarah, if you could ask Dolly any one question only, what would it be?
Holy mackerel. It seems like I ought to have an answer ready for that kind of question. And I've never, I've had a lot of improbable things happen in my life, but it's never because I imagined that they would ever. I can't imagine having the opportunity to ask her a question. So I guess, what I would like to maybe talk to her about my grandma and just kind of so it wouldn't be a question so much as like getting a conversation going about my grandmother Betty, whom I wrote about at length in Heartland, makes a couple appearances in this book because she is a sort of you might think of Dolly Parton as like the celebrity avatar for the real life women like my grandmother, who lived a lot of the hard knocks that Dolly Parton actually escaped: teenage pregnancy, violent, abusive husbands with no economic means to escape, and so on. She lived and survived it. Dolly Parton wrote the songs about it in her early dark music when she wasn't far out of the holler. And I just like, and they were born like 5 months apart or something. So I think I would like to just kind of tell her some stories about my grandma's life and ask her who she knows in her own world that was sort of the model for those myths and legends that she gave us.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I don't even know if it is my responsibility to close it, but I'll do a version of it. This is here it is. She Come By It Natural. Dolly Parton and the Women Who Loved Her Songs. It officially comes out tomorrow. Like it's here. It's here, Sarah. You did it. Drop it tomorrow, so make sure everybody check it out. And Sarah, if whatever I failed to cover, let them know. What did they say earlier where they should go to get it, preferably, so you get the most support and everything?
Oh, well, I appreciate that. First, let me say thank you so much to you, Trae. And I know that this was a great event because of you. I just always like to throw in, especially in these times when independent booksellers need our love more than ever, to whatever book you buy. I hope it's mine, but whatever it is, and Trae's too, try to holler at your independent bookseller in your local community, because We need them to get through these hard times for small businesses, because they're not just about books, they're about community, stories, democracy, access to information. So keep it indie.
Right on. Okay, well, that's it. We made it. We did it.
We did it.
Yay for us. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us, and yeah, make sure you check out the book and everything Sarah does. Thank you all very much. Hang in
Thanks,
there.
Trae.
We're gonna get through it.
We're getting through it.